Okay, hi friends. So, as is probably in the title, if I could fit it in there, this is going to be a more rant or rambly video. Up until now, I hope this was obvious, because I would hope it makes me sound more eloquent. My videos have been scripted, so my process was essentially to write down everything word for word of what I wanted to say, and then record the audio of me reading it, and then edit it into a video with like visuals. Um, right now, it is December 3rd. I don't know when this will be updated or uploaded. And that means that it's finals time, and I don't really have the time to sit down and write more than what I have to write for like my classes. So, in service of having something else on the channel for the year of 2019, hopefully this is still 2019 when this is out, um, I want to talk about social democracy in a style that is not scripted or quite so academic, although the other ones weren't really so academic either, whatever. Um, basically, the reason I chose this instead of some of the other things that I was thinking about talking about, like China or authoritarianism or left communism and things along those lines, is mostly because social democracy is, in my opinion, easy to take down, and also broad enough that I don't so much need specific data points. Now, I alluded in my last video, the Destiny video, that after he said socialism isn't credible as a solution, and implied that social democracy is, I used export data to show that social democracy is, in some aspects, dependent on countries that are not social democracies in order to continue their own existence, and afford themselves, basically. I won't go too far into that argument now, and I didn't go in depth into that argument in the Destiny video. I would rather do that in a scripted setting, because it's kind of a more complex economic topic. So I'll mostly be focusing on more theoretical things for now. Getting started, I guess it's good to define what social democracy is. I would describe it as welfare state capitalism. In the United States, welfare state is kind of a very loosely used term. Uh, so I would say that it is a capitalist system, meaning there are private owners of property who engage in profit making activities, and that is the dominant mode of production. That has some state safety nets there in order to preserve the general dignity and human quality of life of their populations. Some examples of this are, of course, the classic Denmark, Sweden, Norway that Bernie Sanders always uses, but also I would say Germany, Spain, Portugal, France, much of Western Europe. Now, I think one of the first questions I was asking, at least, when I started getting into Marxist literature and communist ideology, was why not just have social democracy? Because at face value, it's easier. You are able to secure a lot of rights for people that in unbridled capitalism aren't there, and you don't seem to need to upend the entire political system to do it. And so when I first started talking to like leftists, at around the time I was sort of radicalizing, that was my main question. I was like, why go through all the trouble to implement a system that is kind of rough around the edges and it's largely theoretical in a lot of cases, et cetera, et cetera. So the main argument I'm going to be saying here is that social democracy is not a principled ideology. I don't think that it can qualify as a complete, full, or principled ideology in any way, shape, or form without being explicitly nationalist or explicitly anti-capitalist in that they want to use it as a stepping stone. So that means that the Social Democratic Party in Germany, for example, or Bernie's wing of the Democratic Party, or in some aspects the Labour Party in Britain, etc., are sort of hollow and don't have a real long-term goal for the world, and I'm going to explain why that matters. So, first of all, I would say that a principled ideology is something that exists either to expand, so it's based on some kind of observation about the human condition or what humans deserve or what humans should have, that they want to expand to all humans, or they have a target population that they want to apply a set of political postulates to. So some examples of this are socialism and communism, especially of the Marxist variety, which is that we have a vision and an end goal of a society that has abolished class relations and has a communal system of ownership. All of our actions, in theory, can be traced back to trying to advance this goal, even if they're not so effective in doing so. On the other side of the spectrum, there is nationalism or white nationalism, which prioritize not humans in general or believe in a certain rights that a human has in general, but rather to a certain group of people. For example, the Nazi Party in Germany had a certain vision of what German people deserved, at the expense of other people, obviously. And less radical examples might include some wings of the Republican Party in the United States, and also parties like the Scottish National Party. Now, the reason these ideologies are principled is that they have a set of, principles and ideas that they are working to apply in general. I don't think social democracy has this because I think that it's self-contradictory. So what do I mean by that? I think that social democrats who are not nationalists, as I said earlier, I think that social democracy is contingent upon an extra step there, such as nationalism or communism as an end goal. I don't think that social democrats are principled because their main premise is that there are certain things that should be taken off of the table that are human rights. It ranges from healthcare to university to sometimes housing, a wage that allows you to provide for necessities, and so on. They believe this without wanting to abolish capitalism in totality. And as I touched on in the Destiny video, I don't think that it's possible to do that and maintain the stability of the capitalist system upon which the expenses for these programs depends. So, for example, allowing for large labor rights and large positive economic rights such as healthcare and college depends, at least in part, on the existence of places with depressed wages. From this, it would follow that social democracy can only expand to a certain amount of people or a certain number of countries before falling in on itself because it no longer has enough places with depressed wages. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So the United States receives a lot of its unskilled labor and raw materials from Mexico and China, but China's a lot more rocky of a case here. Mexico has a very low minimum wage, and there's a lot of exploitation that goes on there, and a lot of it is largely underdeveloped. Companies have chosen to move there because the wages are ultimately lower than that of the United States. Okay, so I said I wasn't going to do this scripted, and that sort of implied that I wouldn't, go back in and, clarify things, but I'm going to anyway because when it comes to this economic data stuff, I said econ, and I really don't want to be misconstrued here. I understand that a lot of the reason that Mexico exports products to the United States is because of NAFTA, and I understand that Canada also exports a lot of things to the United States as well. However, that does not negate the argument that I'm making against social democracy. I would say that NAFTA largely exists for companies that are U.S. and maybe even Canada-based to send raw material gatherers, raw material industry to Mexico, and Mexico still makes up a bit more of a share of U.S. imports than Canada. I also have an article here from the Balance called How Outsourcing Jobs Affects the U.S. Economy. I do want to say that I don't necessarily agree with the point of the author, Kimberly Amadio. I will have her article in the description. But there are a couple quotes that I want to focus on. First, the beginning, which states that in 2015, U.S. overseas affiliates employed 14.3 million workers. The four industries most affected are technology, call centers, human resources, and manufacturing. And one more quote. Thanks to the Great Recession, wages in India began catching up to those in the United States. Average call center workers only make 15% more than their counterparts in India. As a result, some of these jobs are coming back. Now, I think that the point she's trying to make here is that outsourcing isn't as big of a problem as it is. I don't really care about that point. The point that I would like to take away from this little piece of data is that it is shown, because obviously if you have an equality of wages, it's going to be cheaper for a company to hire locally than it is to hire elsewhere, especially when it requires shipping and also plant building in the foreign country. That said, the fact that the jobs are coming back because of a wage increase in India is exactly proving my point. I really just want to stress here that I'm not denying that social democracies have manufacturing sectors, and I'm not denying that manufacturing can still exist. I'm simply saying that there are centers in the world that contribute hundreds of billions of dollars to the manufacturing sector, and companies have enjoyed the low labor regulation and low minimum wages in those countries. That is all I'm saying. Now, if Mexico adopted a higher minimum wage, which to be clear I support, companies would no longer be incentivized to go there, and they would move elsewhere, perhaps India, Bangladesh, maybe China. So if these rights were to be somehow expanded to the entire human population, so maybe the Social Democratic Party equivalent of every single country has gotten into power, then we're going to reach a point where the capitalists don't have a Mexico or an India or a Bangladesh or a China to move to anymore, because every country has created a system with a bunch of wage rights and quality of life rights that prevent companies from being as exploitative as I would argue they have to be in order for consumers to be able to afford their products at this point. And so now we're at a point where social democracy can no longer exist for, I would say, two reasons. One being the paying for these programs, and two being the consumers' ability to pay for products. So the first is that all of these government guarantees, government economic guarantees, are likely going to be contracted to private producers. So if someone has a right to education, the university is going to be buying computers from private computer producers. They're going to construct their buildings out of or from private construction companies, and so on. If there's a right to healthcare, no matter what way it's manifested, almost always drugs are going to be produced by private producers. Much of the medical equipment is going to be produced by private producers, and oftentimes the hospitals are going to be private entities. If we have right to housing, then the houses are probably going to be built by private companies, etc. Now, these private companies, up until now, are largely benefiting, especially in the area of raw materials, from being able to go to places like Mexico, like Bangladesh, like India, like China, etc., for their unskilled labor and for their raw materials. If every country becomes a social democracy, there is no longer a place for that to happen. This is an essential contradiction within capitalism, where the human rights of people are directly opposed to the continued existence of a growing capitalist system. So that's the government purchases reason. The second reason is the ability for the ability of consumers to pay for products. So it is largely tied in with the last reason, in that if wages are considered to be a factor in the production of goods and services, and those wages have a much higher floor now because of the worker rights that are ensured within social democracy, then we've run into a point where the price of products are inevitably going to have to go up at a pace which it would take quite a while for technology and productivity to alleviate. And because of that, products will become very expensive to consumers, and the aggregate demand of the economy will largely decrease. It's also worth noting that the price of wage goods, that is, the goods that consumers are likely to buy, being so high as a result of universal social democracy, is ultimately equal to a wage decrease in real terms. I should talk about that in another video, to be honest. But as I said before, this is not a video on solely the economic aspects of social democracy. It's a video on why it kind of sucks as an ideology and is not really principled, and in fact contradicts itself in existing. So we have just established that social democracy generally can't exist universally within a capitalist market system. Now, as I also mentioned earlier, social democrats are often in rhetoric and in private conversations believers in their ideology because they believe that there is a certain list of economic rights that individuals ought to have. If their ideology, as I said before, cannot be provided to every human being, it's violating its own axiom. It's violating its own assumption that there is a list of rights that people have to have. So because of this, its main principle has been violated not in its actions, but in its theory. This means that even on paper and in the best case scenario, social democracy cannot exist on its own, and it is not an ideology that we should be taking seriously alongside alternatives like socialism. So, I believe that's all I have to say about social democracy. These are the main reasons that I think social democracy is not as great as it sounds, but I would like to say a couple disclaimers. I am not against social democracy as a way of building worker movements. I sort of covered that in both of my Bernie videos, where I do support Bernie's candidacy. I do plan to vote for Bernie Sanders, and I've donated to him, etc., despite him being a social democrat and not a socialist. The reason for this is that I do believe, actually, in the economic rights of people, but I believe that because I'm a socialist, not because I'm a social democrat, and I believe that my ideology can be logically consistent while also providing these rights to every man, woman, and child on the face of this planet. So please don't misconstrue this as me saying that we shouldn't be fighting for higher wages for workers or for the right to healthcare, housing, and education that humans ought to have. I do believe that that is a very noble fight that I would like to partake in even under the current system. Yeah, I believe that that's everything. So I hope you enjoyed, and let me know if there were any inconsistencies or errors or things that I can elaborate more on, because like I said earlier, this was not scripted. Yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.